Hello, my History 157 students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins, and it's now week 3 in this course on U.S. history from 1865 to the present. I'm going to say a few things about week 2 and where to go from here, and then move on to week 3. I just want to say in general that your post and your responses to each other for week 2 were generally pretty good to solid overall. About a third of you were in the very solid to very good to excellent range, so thank you for that. On the two questions in particular, the one question that deals with the issue of immigration and the question of robber barons, I think you, in some respects, overthought the first question and underthought the second. Most of you did question 1 as opposed to question 2. Question 1 really is about the fact that, on the one hand, in general in American culture, we tend to worship people who are billionaires, or in this case, multimillionaires at the time, but in today's dollars, they would be worth like half the Pentagon budget. Rockefeller would have been worth like $340 billion. Maybe more with inflation, maybe 350, $360 billion. Rockefeller would have been, Carnegie would have been worth easily $400 billion himself. Um, um, Henry Ford, by the time he started the Ford Foundation and donated $800 million, which in today's money would be something like $200 billion to his own foundation. I mean, these are ridiculous amounts of money in a society where the average income for a male worker was somewhere between $500 and $1,000 a year. This is what we're talking about in 1870, 1880, $1890. Okay, thousand, maybe you were considered pretty well off if you were making $1,000, even $1,500 a year, not a day, not a month, per year, right? In today's dollars, that would be like 150, I guess, right? But the problem with seeing it that way, of course, is that they didn't have to pay for things like all the everything from buying a home for $1 million to renting a home for $3,000 to all the other ridiculous things that we do now. So that $1,500 would have went a lot longer, but it's still not very good when you see how much these other guys are making, right? So even if you decide to give away some of your money, even if you start a foundation, how much of that is you trying to give back, and how much of that is you trying to correct what otherwise is a very bad record of you, for lack of a way of putting it, screwing people over, right? Crapping on them, denigrating them, putting them in such horrible conditions that they're not making it past the age of 30 or 40 because they're dying on the job. Um, Breaking strikes with scabs to create racial animosity because you particularly selected the handfuls of African Americans living in your cities to work in these factories, so to keep them going in the middle of strikes, where all the white people are out of work because they're trying to get more, trying to make a little bit more money and trying to get some protection, right? Yeah, yeah, these are wonderful people. So I wanted you to be more objective about understanding who these people are, not just go, well, oh, they did these good things. Lowering prices when you're not paying people anything and is what's known as a win-win. You get people who are able to more afford your products, but in the meantime, you're putting other people out of business and putting other people out of work. How good really is that? So it doesn't matter if they're called captains of industry or not. They're still robber barons. And both. Not either or. This is an and both, right? So many things in life are and both. You can do some good things and still generally be an evil, SOB or POS or whatever other terminology you want to use. So that's question 1. Question 2, on immigrants. Most of you didn't even talk about who the immigrants were. You just said immigrants, and that was supposed to cover everything. Some of you, because of the way the chapter was written, conflated Central Eastern European immigration with African American migration, which is happening somewhat at the same time, but not really. Black folk don't generally as a group en masse in large numbers migrate to cities until after about 1910, and certainly during World War I. And the main reason for that was precisely because the war shut off immigration from Europe, including Southern and Eastern Europe. So as a result, you needed excess labor in order to manufacture weapons, among other things, make cars, make steel, whatever. And that labor, cheap labor, had to come from somewhere, and if it wasn't going to come from Southern and Eastern Europe, well, we'll take the black folk. That's how you get part of how reason why you get massive black migration to cities, right? But from 1870 to about the middle of the 1910s, it's with the height around 1910, the year 1910, it's millions of immigrants coming in from Europe every year, right? Hundreds of thousands to millions coming in, mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe, every single year. Um, so there's that. Um, so I've said in the announcements what I've already said about your discussions and all those other things, generally speaking, well, but those are areas where nuance, understanding context, um, being able to make proper relevant connections to the immediate thing that's happening at that time, are important. And and while you show some of that in your initial post, in your responses, that kind of thinking just seems to go away. It's sort of like you're just spouting something instead of really trying to address what that particular peer of yours is saying and trying to amplify certain points in the meantime. Some of you do, most of you are okay this week. You need to step that up a little bit. So look at ones where I might have given a comment and say, wow, this is a really good response. This is an excellent response. And try to pick it up that way, right? So anyway, we'll take a look at your week 2 assignment this week. Try to get those done by Saturday so you have sufficient time to do your primary source assessment assignment, where you try to find primary sources related to your topic and then identify them, and then identify what's a primary source, what's a secondary source, perhaps what's even a tertiary source, say Wikipedia, for instance, right? So there's that. Talk about that a little bit more next week. So anyway, that's due on the 14th of June. Today is week 3. Today is week 3. It's the Gilded Age and Progressivism, the progressive era, the progressive movement, whatever you want to call it. And all that movement is a response to the excesses of the Gilded Age, the age of robber barons, where you have this tremendous amount of wealth building up in cities like New York and Chicago and Washington, D.C., even Philadelphia, other places. Not as much in the South, but you still see with the emergence of the New South, cities like Birmingham, Alabama, and New Orleans, and Atlanta, and Charlotte, and other places where you do see some certain concentrations of wealth. But as many people would describe New York in this period, we're talking about, say, roughly the 1890s, early 1900s, the first decade of the 20th century. Turn of the 20th century New York is basically Mumbai or Calcutta, where you have tremendous amounts of wealth, people throwing parties every night kind of wealth, showing off their bling kind of thing, right? You know, just massive amounts of, people handing out $100 bills, like, $100 is like a penny, right? Like, there's so much hyperinflation that $100 can only buy you a loaf of bread, except that in this case, $100 can buy you a heck of a lot more. Side by side, people who are literally living in the streets, who, are on sidewalks or homeless, and you're stepping over them to get into your, brownstone on Fifth Avenue, or your nice, mansion, urban mansion on Central Park South in New York. Yes, I am originally from the New York City area. And so the result is that you have this excess, and there are people around who are seeing this at the time. Even rich people are going, "This isn't right. This is not right. We need to do something about this." Now, a lot of rich people are like, "Well, screw you. You screwed up. It's your life. Everyone. It's every man and woman. Well, they wouldn't have even said woman. Every man for themselves, right? I got mine. Screw you." And that's the nicest thing they would have said. And especially if you're a white ethnic, if you weren't white Anglo-Saxon Protestant and you found yourself homeless, living on a park bench, getting bullied by police, etc., too effing bad. That's your life. But there were a lot of middle class reformers, particularly in cities like New York, and muckrakers and other people who saw what was going on and said, no, this is not right. You know, Andrew Carnegie can write about the social gospel, or the gospel or wealth or whatever we're calling this crap, all he wants. But until he started building libraries in the late 1890s, early 1900s, he wasn't exactly giving back to even his Pittsburgh community. And he spent half his time living in New York, on Park Avenue himself. So I this fascination with billionaires and really, really rich people beyond just wanting to be them seems to me, misplaced and sort of narcissistic. But that's a story for another course, which I don't teach at UMGC anyway. So anyway, the main theme for this week in terms of your readings is the progressive era and what people who are not entirely aligned with the interest of the rich are trying to do to help ordinary people, right? You can talk about Jane Addams and her work, with white women, with women who find themselves indigent in Chicago. You can talk about, Helen Keller to some extent in her work with folks who had disabilities, who can't read, can't write, can't see, right? You can talk about that. You can talk about Jacob Riis and his muckraking work, or Thomas Nast and his muckraking work, or Nellie Bly and her work to practically single-handedly help dismantle Standard Oil from being the grand monopoly that it was and kind of still is. All these gas companies, all these different names, are essentially Standard Oil, just in different parts of the world and different parts of the U.S. But hey, what do I know? I'm just a historian who happens to be able to trace the roots of things back to a certain period of time. But anyway, you have muckrakers, and you have people in government. At one point, you know, Wisconsin had a very high concentration of socialists, right, who actually came to power. Lafayette and all these other people came to power as congressmen and senators and mayors and even the governorship in the early 19 teens, and fought for such socialist ideas like the 8-hour workday, minimum wage, workers' compensation, unemployment benefits until you can find work. Those ideas that we take for granted now, those are all socialist ideas, since everyone in this country seems to be so freaking afraid of socialism. Those are socialist ideas, that people shouldn't be worked to death, that people should have compensation when they get hurt on the job through no fault of their own, other than the fact that you set up this unsafe workplace where someone could easily get hurt. But yeah, socialism. So that's part of the more leftist side of progressivism. But anything to the left of supporting a plutocratic state is going to seem leftist by comparison. And a plutocratic state is pretty freaking conservative. It means government doesn't give a crap about average people, right? And even at the federal level, you start to see signs of progressivism. You get the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, the first act to really say, hey, maybe monopolies aren't so great. Maybe we need to regulate this stuff. So you have the first regulations against monopolies passed in 1890. Now, is it being regularly enforced in 1890? Of course not. So many politicians are in the pockets of, these robber barons that they're not going to immediately act. But basically, McKinley gets elected in 1896 on the basis of saying he's going to be one of these antitrust reformers. And of course, Theodore Roosevelt, his successor after McKinley's assassinated in 1901, also fights for this. In fact, he fights even harder. But it's really under Taft that some of these monopolies are finally taken down. U.S. Steel's broken up a little bit. Standard Oil's definitely broken up a lot. The famous antitrust case of 1911, the Supreme Court finally breaks them up early, and fairly early. Doesn't completely take care of the problem. We still have plenty of monopolies today. We have public utilities, electrical, electricity, for instance, electrical companies, which are supposed to be public owned, right? Making profit year after year using the same crappy equipment that goes back literally 100 plus years. So, you know, so there, none of this stuff is perfect. But my point, though, is when thinking about this era, thinking about all that's happening in this period, you're talking about people who are documenting the horrors of this period, the literal shit and filth that people are living in tenements, on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, um, or in Five Points, other parts of Manhattan, and the South Side of Chicago, West Baltimore, East Baltimore, right? There really aren't any nice working class neighborhoods in these cities at this point. There aren't any. There might be a few middle class ones here or there, right? And some of these cities are so dirty that rich people end up moving to the suburbs, right? In New York, for instance, people move, some of these enclaves like Bronxville, New York, um, Scarsdale, Tuckahoe, for those who happen to know anything about the New York area, or for that matter, to use DC, since many of you are from this area. Places like Chevy Chase and Bethesda and Potomac, and even, you know, as you come out into parts of even what would have been Silver Spring, you would have seen farms, but you've also have seen mansions. If you drive right down Connecticut Avenue, um, headed toward 495 as you leave DC into Chevy Chase and Kensington, you can see the what used to be mansions with or what would have been mansions at that period with servant houses right next to them. Okay, so that's the contrast we're talking about. So you got the Gilded Age on the one hand, and people who recognize the ills of the Gilded Age and want to do something about them on the other. And progressivism kind of died. Well, it didn't die, but that form of progressivism kind of, I shouldn't say it petered out. It became a shell of itself by the end of the 19 teens for a whole variety of reasons, one of which is World War One. Another one was the Spanish flu epidemic. Excuse me, let me put that in more specific terms. The Spanish flu pandemic, kind of like what we're dealing with now, because of changes demographically to the country, because in the end, certain forces won out. The conservative forces that wanted prohibition, the conservative forces that wanted immigrants out of the country, the conservative forces that weren't particularly happy with black people migrating to cities in the north and northeast and the Midwest, right? Those forces won, at least temporarily. We'll see the struggle between progressivism and much more conservative forces again during the Great Depression. But point being that this is a period where these forces come to the fore, and with them the ills of um, massive class inequalities. Right? People complain about class warfare all the time, just as an aside. But how's it war when the other side can't fight? Or if they do fight, they get their heads beat in, they get shot, they get assassinated, their unions are crushed, right? They lose their jobs. They might be blackballed from certain industries, might not even be able to find work in the city in which they're living. You know, all leading to lots of stress and early deaths, right? But yeah, class warfare. Anyway, that's all I have to say about this week. There isn't much more to it, and that's really the flip side of what we're doing week 2. So, happy hunting, happy reading. We'll see you in discussions this week.